you all for joining. I will quickly introduce myself and then turn it over to my colleague Toby. But today, what to expect is we will go over a little bit about how the appropriations process really works, why science research really does matter, and how those really play a factor together. But I will turn it over to my colleague Toby Smith.
Thanks, Justin. I'm pleased to be talking to you today, and if we can, let's go ahead and go to the
One.
um, to the slides. Um, jump to the next one. Let me actually, I will introduce myself. I'm the Senior Vice President for Government Relations and Public Policy at the Association of American Universities. AU represents 69 leading U.S. research universities, public and private, and two in Canada. And a little bit about my background. I've spent 30 years now representing higher education and research universities, doing government relations, 22 years here at AU, and then before that, worked for the University of Michigan, which is my alma mater, and for the Vice President for Research, doing research development and government relations. And prior to that, spent 7 years at MIT, and before that, I worked on Capitol Hill. So just to give you a little bit of background about what we're talking about today is just in terms of, why does federal research funding matter? And so the first, of course, is that the research that goes to the universities we represent here at AAU, and the faculty, and that many of you are involved in even working on in labs on your campuses or with your advisors, is that it produces innovative discoveries that benefit not only the researchers on our campuses, but these days we're talking a lot about the benefit to the public, and that those then result in economic benefits. They result in new cures. They result in things that change and improve people's lives. And so it's really important to get that out. It's really important as we talk about why does research matter, not only think about it in terms of why it matters to you as a graduate student, but why does it matter to the average person? As I say, I grew up in rural Michigan, in a town called Carroll, Michigan, less than 2,000 people. Why does it matter to people who live there?
But
And I'd
I,
say it
I
matters because
literally feel
of
this.
agriculture research that benefits folks, because it's a largely agriculture business. My father worked in the auto industry. It benefits the manufacturing they would do there, and the list goes on. So from the perspective of students, though, it is really important. This is something members of Congress don't often understand, is that federal research funding in the United States, and the system was set up this way. It's one of the things that made the system unique. And if you go and study understand the very reason why research universities were used in the U.S. post-World War II to do research on behalf of the government, it was the notion that in funding research on campuses, that research funding could do double duty, not only providing those new innovations that we see, but also training the next generation of scientists and engineers, because it has been graduate students often and postdocs who really do a lot of the research, do a lot of the work in the lab. And so that apprentice system that was created, it's really the vision of Vannevar Bush, who wrote a seminal piece that has guided our science policy for now over 75 years, was this idea that research funding would do double duty, not only supporting new innovations, new science, but training the next generation of scientists and engineers. So it is important that be something you talk about, because it's unique to why many of you care about this, and that universities are really ideal to do that. You couldn't do that and train the next generation of engineers if you were doing federal research at national labs or in industry. And so bottom line is, without sustained funding for research, the public loses not only innovative discoveries, but they lose the talent base that has driven our security, our economy, our environment, energy, healthcare, and the list goes on. And there's more on why research matters at the URL there. And I'm going to turn things now to Justin.
Thanks, Toby. And I did neglect to mention this at the beginning. I'm going to toss a link in the chat. This includes a templated letter that we really encourage you guys to use. We'll go over why this is so important. But this letter can be sent to your members of Congress and really focuses on why research funding matters, which is very timely for what I will go over now, which is the appropriations process. This can seem like a daunting piece of the legislative branch. Well, I guess it really goes through the executive too, but it really is super important. And right now we are coming up on the deadline for these appropriations bills, which I'll get into. But I will explain that to you guys. So the appropriations agencies and their research funds come from appropriations bills. These are signed into law by the president, but before it is signed into law, a lot of steps occur. And the appropriations process usually does follow a fiscal year. So that is coming up on October 1st and is when the fiscal year 26 bill is supposed to be signed into law by. And currently we are under a fiscal year 25. So it's different than a calendar year. But the first step of this process is the president sends the PBR, which is the president's budget request. It's sent to both chambers of Congress pretty early into the year. After that, both the House and Senate began working on their own appropriations bills, and in total, there are 12 bills. So if the House and Senate have their own separate, that means there's 24. And then the appropriations bills will be drafted, passed through the appropriations committees, and then after that, it is moved on to the full House and Senate floor. So the members of Congress that make up these appropriations committees are super, super, super important. They're the ones actually drafting these bills and they take the first stab at it. So those are the people you really want to convince that research matters. And when there is a disagreement, which we see very often nowadays, there are three options for the House and Senate. They can go to a conference committee, which means they work out the differences between the House and Senate bills, or they can exchange amendments. So they can change something in one bill they don't like, and as long as they agree, then all's good. Then they can pass that off, or the House or Senate can give in and just decide they want to pass the other chamber's bill. So if the House bill has a more likely chance to get signed by the president, the Senate might just say, okay, we'll go with the House bill. We'll bring that to the floor and we'll pass it. What I will say is the past few years, the appropriations process has not been typical. The PBR has sometimes come later in the year, which leads the chambers of Congress to get a little bit of a delayed start on the bills. And we are currently operating in fiscal year 25 under a continued resolution, which I'll get into a little bit later. But the next slide will show you guys what a timeline should look like. So you'll see that the White House in February will usually send off the request. And when I say request, I mean it is just a request. The PBR doesn't really hold any standing. It's just kind of like a wish list that the president will send to Congress, and it's up to them whether they co-sign that or if they completely disagree with it. Then the bills go to the budget committees where they develop the budget resolutions, and then it'll go to the appropriations subcommittees and then to the White House. That is the typical process, but like I said, this is not a typical time for appropriations or just government in general. And next slide, please. And this is really timely for what we're going through right now. So Congress has not passed the 12 bills, which leads them to two options, which you guys will probably hear a lot in the news this week and next week. They can either sign a continued resolution before October 1st. This would basically continue flat funding for what they did in the previous year. So right now we are under a full year CR, which means last year Congress failed to pass their fiscal year 25 appropriations bills. So instead, they passed a full year continued resolution, which technically means, if you're following this along, that the fiscal year 24 flat funding is still going on now. So what they passed a couple years back, we are still under. And if no CR is passed, is when we lead to a government shutdown. This means that non-essential funding is halted. Both parties really want to avoid this because it doesn't look good on either of them. Sometimes it can be used as a power power grab, but at the end of the day, no one likes when the government is shut down. It doesn't really benefit anyone. And when the government does shut down, this really can delay a lot of research grants. It can delay review. It delays a lot. So it's really important that this is avoided at all costs. And next slide, please. So the current state, as I said, we're operating under continuing resolution since Congress could not pass the 25 bills. Um, the CR, depending on how you look at things, is not always the worst case scenario. What we saw from the PBR, and I'll get into that in a little bit, is that there was drastic cuts to research. And if Congress were to take drastic cuts, sometimes the appropriations that we passed in 24 is actually not as a drastic cut as we could experience. So it's not always the worst thing to have a CR. Um, but as I said, the good news is the PBR can really just be seen as a wish list. Congress doesn't have to follow that. And Congress is still technically, even though the deadline's coming up, they're still working on passing those 12 appropriations bills. For the most part, both chambers, the House and Senate, although they are controlled by Republicans, they have denied a lot of the drastic cuts that Trump has proposed, especially in the research area, which is really great news that they are seeing the value of science. We'll see if that is passed by Trump when these all make their way through. But as I said, the deadline is September 30th for Congress to decide to pass a CR since they don't have time to pass all these bills. Right now, it looks like there is likely going to be a shutdown, considering the House has passed the CR, but in the Senate, it requires a 60 vote margin to pass the CR, which means Democrats would have to be on board with this CR. And right now, they are asking that there are some healthcare benefits added into this CR package so that it will help healthcare. But it is unlikely that Republicans will give in on that demand. So a shutdown is likely, but we are unsure how long that may occur for. Next slide. And these are just the top lines for the agencies. We pulled a few. These are just like the AAU agencies we really advocate for, but I'm sure there are many more. So if anyone has any questions about an agency that's not on here, feel free to shoot me a message and I can pull those for you. But the growing trend that you'll see on this slide is that the PBR cuts are very drastic. This is concerning because Trump really wants to cut budgets everywhere. It's really not just science funding, it's across the whole board. So as I said, the good news is the House and Senate aren't fully buying into this huge drastic cut. The House a little bit more so than the Senate. The Senate numbers tend to usually be a little bit closer to what we would hope to see. But this could all change depending on just what happens with the CR, what happens with the shutdown, and so on. But it's really, really important that members of Congress, especially appropriators, hear from students and hear from researchers that are actually benefiting from these dollars. And when you can actually put a story to a dollar amount, it really does make a huge impact. I think a lot of the times in DC, we talk about numbers a lot, and sometimes the actual story gets lost in that when you're talking to members of Congress. So really being a benefit to yourself, student voices do matter, researchers matter, scientists matter. So really making sure that case is made because science policy does help the economy, it helps the environment, it helps national security. It really does touch on so many different factors. So I really encourage you guys, if you do decide to use that templated letter to really make your voices heard on that. Next slide. And this is just how to find your members of Congress. I'm sure a lot of you do know, but this slide is here just in case you guys need any help with that. Um, and when you are looking for your members of Congress, please make sure you are using where you are registered to vote. I know a lot of students that are on campus might use their campus address to vote, but a lot of students use their home address as well, where their family are. So make sure you guys are using the correct address on your voter registration because you are a constituent to that member of Congress, and your voice matters more than anyone else that could message them. And I really do encourage you guys, if your parents have somewhere else that is registered, to really tap in with them. Sometimes people who are registered on their campus, their parents might be registered back home, which means two representatives can knock two birds out with one stone. So I encourage you guys to really spread the good word on science funding and encourage everyone to reach out to their members of Congress. Next slide. And these next few slides are just who are the Appropriations Committee. Um, these people, as I said, they are the ones drafting these bills, and they are the ones who are really the people you want to target. So if you do have a member who's on this list, it's really important to point out in your letters, like, hey, I know you're an appropriator. I really encourage you to do this. And it doesn't hurt if your member isn't an appropriator, because at the end of the day, when the vote is brought to the floor, their vote equals just as much as an appropriator at that point. So they are just some extra powerful people in Congress since they get the first say and kind of the final say almost. And these are just some pointers if you guys do decide to use those templated letters. Make sure you point out which agency your funding comes from if you're receiving research funding. And when describing your research, it's really important to get to the why it matters part. A lot of members of Congress, this may surprise you, are not scientists. So sometimes they don't understand fully what something on a super micro level means. And really driving your story on from why it matters, not just in the lab, but in the long term, really does help them understand why it has a greater benefit to the public. So really making that case for why it matters in a concise, like 2 to 3 sentences can really, really help. And if you guys do decide to send your letters, just make sure you proofread. And as I said before, if you do have an appropriator, try to make sure you do mention that they are an appropriator because that goes a very, very long way. Next slide. And yeah, final step. If you guys do decide to send a letter, there should be 3 if you guys want to be extra, extra achievers, because you'll have 2 members from the Senate and 1 from the House. Um, if you go on the members website, this is where you can copy and paste your letters into. It'll likely ask you to fill out your address. This is just to double check that you are, in fact, a constituent. And once you send the letter, thank you so much. Great job. And I believe NSPN is providing certificates if anyone does send a letter. So it not only gets you a fun certificate, but it also means you made a major grassroots impact that members of Congress really do want to hear from students. And they want to see, even if you have a Democrat as your member of Congress, it's still really important to tap in with them because even though they are champions for science and they believe that science funding should be flourishing, it's important to really thank them for being champions and to remind them that there are people who are benefiting from these dollars. So, next step. And I believe I'll be turning it back to Toby now on this student engagement part.
Yeah, thanks, Justin. I want to talk. I started by talking about why federal research funding matters, and I want to end by talking about why your engagement as students really matters, and that you can make a significant difference. And of course, you telling the story of why and examples of innovation and how you've seen research benefit society is good. And we know that there are these proposed cuts, so we need as many people engaging with members of Congress. And having started my career on Capitol Hill, my boss would often come and say, "What's the mail look like? What are we hearing from constituents?" He's a populist Democrat, and he wanted to know what people back home were telling him. And he also chaired the committee that funded the National Science Foundation and NASA. He didn't hear a whole lot from people back home about scientific research. So if he heard, that was a good thing. It didn't take many letters to make a real difference. And it's really important to thank members and to kind of, if they do good things and if they've been supportive of research, to thank them. That's also something you can do on social media. If you follow AAU, for example, on social media, we'll often thank members, and you amplifying when we do that for votes or things. That's really a good thing. And as we know too, right now, there's a lot of questions. Is the money that's being spent for research worth it? There's a lot of stories out there about money being wasted, not being used well. And I think it's really important to counter. Sometimes that's a misunderstanding. Or it's uh, misunderstanding that's guided by a willful ignorance. And so telling how research, especially basic research, works, that oftentimes major discoveries come from things that were totally unpredictable, unexpected, And that's how basic science works, that you can't predict the outcome when you start the research or the benefits that it will have. So telling those stories, always having from your discipline in your back pocket, kind of, and even in letters, like my research in my field has led to these advances that have made a big difference. But the other thing I want to say that's different is a lot of members of Congress never worked. They never got a, they never, they're paying back their student loans. They were never paid off a graduate, off of a research assistantship or a grant. They don't even know that research does that double duty that I told you about in the beginning. Who's the best people to talk about the importance of research funding, supporting training in STEM are the students who are actually being trained. Don't underestimate the impact you can have. I will tell you, when I worked at MIT, the story I often tell graduate students is I was trying, so MIT had like a $30 million, $35 million fusion reactor, fusion center. And I could not get Senator Kennedy's uh, education LA or her legislative assistant, his staffer, to return my calls to talk about fusion. The only time that really, she didn't return my call, she called me because a group of graduate students from the Fusion Center had written concerned about future funding for research. And she said, her question to me was, do you know who led this letter? Because students are really important to the senator. I want to contact them and reach out and talk to them. And so that was my contact, is actually it came from the students asking to get to her and the senator, not necessarily anything I could do. And I've taken in, lab directors, and of course they're going to say research is really important, but you providing a perspective of why that research is helping you to learn about STEM, learn about science, learn about your discipline, do research, learn how to be a scientist is really incredibly valuable. So don't underestimate the impact you can have. By the way, it goes beyond that. As we try and reach as many members of Congress, it's not beyond we're just talking about you writing a letter, but I know there are, I think Carnegie Mellon has a parents postcard campaign where they're writing and getting parents of the graduate students to send letters to say how important graduate education is to their son or daughter who's in a program, and explaining this very thing, but from a parent's perspective. And by the way, sometimes from a red district in a Republican member that we really need to get to, versus oftentimes our universities are in Democratic districts, which are still important to get to, but getting out and getting as many people as we can is really important. So that gets me to the last point, is hearing from constituents is really important. We need as many people to be weighing in right now, because the funding decisions about research are being discussed in Congress. As we know, there might be a shutdown, but then after that, they're going to continue. And so we need to get, in the next couple of months, as many, whether it's letters, phone calls, contacts with congressional members about the importance of scientific funding for these key agencies, the ones that you may be receiving funding from, to support your research and education as possible. So just be clear, you can really make a difference. Students matter. Members listen to students more than you might think. So don't underestimate your potential impact.
Can I jump in with a question?
Sure.
Okay. So you said that you worked for a member?
Yep.
Okay. So behind the scenes, I'm just trying to help everyone wrap their head around it. We have 535 members of Congress. We have 330 million people. How come, or what does a member do with 5 letters? What does that member do if 5 students from X university, how does that matter behind the scenes? What is,
So, yeah, good. It's a very good question. Um, who do members often hear from? They hear from senior citizens about their concerns about Social Security. Senior citizens have lots of time to write. They hear from uh, local businesses who are concerned about, economic related issues, new taxes. Um, they don't hear very often from scientists. They don't hear very often from students. When they do, especially if there's somebody that may be on a key funding committee that does fund, like my boss did, the National Science Foundation, they're going to treat those letters a little bit differently because they actually have jurisdiction and they can do something. And so don't underestimate, I'd say, and the other thing, having been a legislative assistant, the question was always, what's the downside of supporting something? If I got one letter and it was easy and it wasn't a hard thing for my boss to support, we'd do it because it made one more constituent happy. It was only when, oh, there's real consequences. If I support this, they're not going to do it. So it's really, don't underestimate, 3 or 4 letters can be a lot in an area that where the member says, yeah, or it just endorses them. That's the other reason about, if you do know what they've done, how they voted, take the opportunity to thank them. I really appreciate it. I know in the past you've been a great supporter of research. I hope you'll continue. So the other thing that we didn't talk much about is do a little bit of homework. Find out if your member has what they've said on research. Not all of them will have said anything, but some will, and try and make sure you're kind of aware of where they're at. So a few letters can make a big difference.
And that can be called like earned media, where if you put it on social media, thank you for your past votes, that's
Correct.
earned media. They earned that based on their past votes. So it's kind of doing it in two angles.
That's why when we know, I'm going to give you a real life example. Senator Katie Britt from Alabama earlier this year, and you can go back and look at the tweet or I guess post now on X, right? And we also have Blue Sky, right? AAU thanked Senator Britt because she led a letter where she was joined by 13 of her colleagues, encouraging the department, basically the administration and the HHS, NIH, to release funds that they were not spending. We thanked her for that letter. Having you then follow and amplify the fact that this is great. I also, as a student studying, and receiving support from NIH, greatly appreciate and then make sure you tag her. Senator Britt did. And to get 10 of those tags on social media, a huge difference. And don't underestimate that Senator Britt saw that because you tagged her. So, and her staff is following. And my gosh, what she did got noticed and appreciated. So, again, there's a lot of things we can do to amplify senators who are going out in what's sometimes, particularly for Republicans, a tough time to go against the administration or tell them they need to change course. But that's a perfect example. So again, the thank yous are really something we don't do enough of, and we can do better. And students, again, can help us with that.
And I wanted to piggyback on what Toby just said about students. In DC, there's a lot of groups, there's a lot of higher education associations, there's a lot of stakeholders here that are writing letters and are meeting with members of Congress and their staff on appropriations. But when it really comes from a student perspective rather than an association or just another lobbyist in DC, it goes tenfold. It matters so much more because you guys are really the ones benefiting from this research and the research funds. And you guys are the ones in the labs, you guys are the ones doing the work. And as much as we can advocate on your behalf, the actual person benefiting makes a much bigger impact and a much bigger splash in the pool. So I really, really encourage you guys to keep going on with the good work and really, really message your members of Congress, even if it's a phone call. Sometimes a quick phone call, even though you're just getting a staffer, that does get written down and they tell their boss, hey, I got a phone call today from this student from this university and they thanked me or they encouraged us to support federal research funding. And that does make a huge difference to having that one-on-one call. So, yeah.
It's really our representative democracy in action. And it's it does seem subtle, and it does seem behind the scenes, and it doesn't seem like it's really effective. But I also have been that kind of that aide in a committee, and it is amazing where five letters has changed a vote, right? And so you'd be amazed at how small numbers really can have an impact behind the scenes. Okay, take it away.
One other thing I just want to say, when you think about how you write to a member of Congress, you want to be careful because it's very easy. You're not talking to one of your colleagues or a fellow student or your advisor. You're talking to a member of Congress, and stories probably are more valuable. And the personal value, the personal story of you as a student, as opposed to here's what I'm doing, here's the technical details of my research. They won't understand that, but they get that you're a student. They get that you're receiving funding through grants if you explain it and why it's so important. So that personal piece is really what often is more compelling to members than the research details themselves. So just keep that in mind. They are like me. I didn't study science in college. I was, unless you consider political science science. Um, but so stories really matter, and personal stories about people who live in their districts are what they care about.
And I think that I'm going to highlight that again. So, in thinking about this in the context of behind the scenes, yesterday we talked about in session one, we talked about um, evidence alone rarely influences change, not behavior change and not policy votes. And sometimes we have to think about what else will influence. And stories really influences people's behaviors. And so, telling your story is a first start. So your story, the impact on your life, but also your research on the lives of many others. Why is your research so important? Why are you doing it? Do you have more slides? Because I also have another question about coalitions.
We were just going right into open forum, so feel free to ask.
Great. So you spoke just at the end about how there are other groups doing sort of writing campaigns, grassroots activation, and that AAU, Association for American Universities, is also doing it. So can you talk about sort of the role of your association and how you are working behind the scenes to impact policymaking?
Yeah. So we represent, as Toby said, 69 US research universities. So behind the scenes, we are constantly in contact with members of Congress, especially the appropriations committees, on the importance of federal research, the importance of just universities in general. Right now, it's a crucial time to make the case for universities while that's kind of under threat. So behind the scenes, we're writing lots of letters to members of Congress. We also have our own campaign going on, and I'll let Toby talk about that, Research for a Stronger America. But there's a lot of things going on right now. I think in the current state of events, we're looking for a lot of new creative ways. That's why we are really trying to target students right now and trying to get them engaged because we know how important your guys' voices are. So I think that's a little bit, but I'll let Toby kind of explore a little bit more on that.
Yeah, hopefully this is, so there's two things I just put up in the chat. Let me start with the second first. That builds off of the campaign that we are involved in. And that is actually, we have started a grassroots campaign separate from AAU, but we've created a grassroots lobbying organization, or a 501c4 organization called Research for a Stronger America. If you go to that website, researchforu.us, you will get to the page. Hopefully I got the link right because I typed it from memory. But if you didn't, we can get the right one up there. But that takes you to a page. Yeah, there, it's working. That takes you to a page that actually helps you. And we are targeting certain states where we're trying to get people, but you can use that form to help you guide and get to your member of Congress, find them, It's called the voter voice page, and it basically scripts what you can say. But really do take advantage. If you were to use that as opposed to the template that Justin provided, make sure to talk about that personal part. Personalize the letter. That's what really makes a difference. Otherwise, it just looks, we call them robo letters, the ones that would come in and they're all the same. It's much better if you take the time to talk about why this matters to you and why you think it matters to the constituents. That's what my boss wanted to know is what's it matter to my constituents? I don't care what it matters. Yeah, the professor at the University of Michigan is going to get funding and it's going to support their job. But what do I tell my constituent who's worried about whether they're going to have a job tomorrow? Why we should also be spending money on federal research. So that campaign is going. That's a grassroots campaign. We're trying to get as many people to contact members as possible. The other thing is to bring you ask about how AAU works to try and support research or what coalitions we might try and do. And so we're all about in an environment where maybe our presidents aren't always the people who members of Congress are going to listen to or trust these days, given that our institutions have, some of them in particular, have been under attack these days. Who are the third-party advocates who can speak about the importance of research? And by the way, students are one of the groups we keep saying are important beneficiaries of what federal research produces. Who are others? Well, companies and local businesses who benefit from having universities spending money in their communities from those federal research dollars that support the local business or or that company that produces the some of the equipment for the labs. So we did, and those people, and we have all these small startup companies. So we got a bunch and facilitated a letter that went in yesterday, signed by 170 different individuals from venture capitalists to founders of startup companies. Some of these are faculty at our own companies. People like John Hennessy, who is a former president of Stanford, but he's also on the board of Alphabet, aka Google. He's the chair of that board. So he's on this letter. Vince Cerf, who's one of the founders, basically known as one of the fathers of the internet and created the standards, signed this letter. But then it's also got like the Houston Chamber of Commerce, the Illinois Business Council. Those are all important. So getting business to speak up. So we are trying to get other voices to weigh in. Earlier this year, we led a similar effort. That was a letter that went on the importance of NSF, signed by defense leaders like former Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel. What's another good group of users out there who's doing great work right for us? We are working very hand in glove with patient groups, the beneficiaries of the cures that NIH has funded through the years, to go up to the Hill and talk about why funding for NIH research in cancer or diabetes or rare diseases, and the list goes on, is so critical. They are the best advocates and they were just on the Hill a week ago, and there's nobody better than those folks who are direct beneficiaries to talk about the value of research. So, Justin, I don't know if there's anything you want to
Yeah,
add.
just building on that, we do work really closely with a couple groups. My colleagues Matt and Lisbeth aren't here today, but I know they would flag these for everyone. There's a group called United for Medical Research that does a lot of work for NIH specific, and another group called CNSF, which is focused specifically on NSF. We work really closely with these groups as well, and they have their own letters they send that we collaborate with them on. They have their own advocacy they work on. So there's tons and tons of coalitions. These are just a little bit more focused on one agency specific. But I wanted to make sure we flag those as well because these are also some great organizations that are helpful.
One other tip, and then I think we got a question, so I don't want to keep talking, but there's usually a government relations person who works for your scientific society. If you're not a part of a scientific society, it's a good reason to join, is to find that person who does government relations, say you're interested in helping. How can I do that? Now, I'm not going to say it always works, but a lot of those government relations people, when they find a student that wants to do it, you may be invited and say, well, we have a fly-in on X day. Can you come in? Can we, and so take advantage of utilizing, as I say, one of the things when you're trained in science, you know about science, but you don't know about policy. So you can read a book on policy, that's great. But I often say if you were visiting, I talk about my job being one in cross-cultural communications, that if I were going to a foreign country, I could read a book and read the guide, but I'd be, I wouldn't understand the language. But if I had somebody who did, they can serve as a tour guide. So guidebooks are good, but tour guides are much better. That government relations person in that scientific society can be your tour guide to helping you engage with members of Congress. And they want people who are willing to engage because a lot of scientists don't have the time, don't take the trouble. And students are even a bonus, I think, for a lot of those folks when they find students that want to get engaged.
Yeah, and I think absolutely. And I think it highlights that, evidence alone, just putting your articles in a journal and going to conferences isn't enough. And there's a lot of things that go on behind the scenes that you may never have known about. So really take advantage of a lot of these opportunities. Georgia.
Hi, yeah, thanks for this. It's really interesting. So I have a really technical question. I think in science, many of us are not really constituent. We come here with visa, we might go back to our country, we might stay here forever, but we're gonna live here for like, you know, at least some years. But we don't vote here. So how do we actually, contact these people? Should we just ask to some internal like association, or should we just not say anything? Like,
I think there's two kind of answers to this question. I think the first being you can still contact the member who is in the district that you are residing in. But the second part is every university has a government relations team, and connecting with them can be really helpful on getting your message across because they are in constant communication with their delegation for their campus. So I think those two can really help. And I think, when we talk about, students who are coming to America, I think that workforce question is something that goes a very long way. When people stay here, work here, they're really helping the economy and helping our workforce just be stronger, which I think is a huge, huge tool that is greatly appreciated. I don't know if Toby has a different answer or something to
I
elaborate
think
on
the other thing, yeah, I just say that I think don't, again, even if you're not voting, you could always, like if you were visiting a member who was represented the university that you're attending, you might want to go in with somebody who does vote there and have them validate the importance of working with colleagues from other countries, how you as an, basically colleagues who are international students are contributing to the research. But the other story that's really important is the value that international students coming to the US have contributed because they often don't leave. And if you look at AI companies in the United States, the top artificial intelligence companies, over 50% of those top AI companies were created by foreign-born founders who came to the US. Many of them studied at our universities, decided never to leave, and they started a company that's helping our national defense, our economy, and growing AI, which is, we know that's what everybody's talking about here in Washington. So making a case, even if you don't vote, why international students, and frankly, we've been dealing with this right now because just on Friday, what happened? Oh, we're now going to charge $100,000 fee for individuals who come here on H-1B visas. Some people don't even get paid that amount, right? I mean, who come, but they are very talented. And so that's a big issue. And I think we need the more people we have saying things. So get examples of international founders, find that data, do your homework, and make a good case, and try and send a letter anyhow. The other thing is you don't have to say where you vote or whether you're on the voter list. You have a zip code and you write a letter. They probably aren't going to check if you're an international student at the university. Just say, I go to, and don't necessarily reveal in the letter that you don't vote because you're in. My wife doesn't vote. She's a green card holder, but can't vote because she's never gotten citizenship. She lived here 30 years now, right? So, but I would still tell her to write write the governor and they would never know. So that's the other trick. Don't think they'll know you're an international student. You don't have to disclose it. Say
Yeah.
that international students are really important.
And I think, many of us are switching from the word, citizen science, to, or, if you're a citizen of that community, to constituent, because that reflects all of the people in the community accurately. And you are a constituent because you do reside there and you do pay your sales tax every time you purchase something, right? And so,
Correct.
or if you live in anywhere except for Oregon, I believe. So I think that it's important to remember that you belong and you are a constituent and you should write as well as representative of that neighborhood.
Thank you.
Other questions? Talking all about the behind the scenes and the grassroots efforts and how it really does make a difference, even though oftentimes we think like our one vote doesn't matter, our one letter doesn't matter. You'd be surprised, like it does, telling our story. So we have a comment: as a science educator from outside the US, I wonder how appropriations decisions, especially for research funding, consider global collaborations in science and education. Can anyone speak to that?
Yeah, I can take the first stab at it unless Toby, were you about to say something?
Go for it.
Okay. Yeah, I think that appropriators really do take that collaboration into mind when they are doing research funding appropriations. I think more members of Congress than not. I think the idea of global collaboration is something that they know is a benefit to the US and is a benefit to the universities. Um, so I think that the global collaboration part, I think that we are better when we collaborate. So that's my personal stance on it. So I think that global collaboration is important, and I think a lot of appropriators do keep that in mind, that a lot of the work that does go on is a international collaboration. And I think when they're making the case on keeping America winning and keeping America at the forefront of innovation, I think that really stems from our collaborative nature that we do have with a lot of countries. But yeah.
So let me just add, it is a time when we need to continue, and I think a lot of members do get the value of international scientific collaboration. There are those who don't. There are those who think that we should just wall in our science, not share it. And frankly, we shouldn't even publish it because, my gosh, if we publish a paper on AI, we might be giving China a leg up. Um, and you all as researchers need to help explain how walling in science does not help us. How we learn from open science in publications, whether it's published by a Chinese researcher or a US researcher. In fact, I will argue if we aren't collaborating with scientists in China, we are not going to know where China is in the research, and they will leapfrog us in critical areas of technology, much like they did with 5G. So there's benefits from that collaboration. The other thing, in terms of Congress, there are programs that they fund, or there are big machines. Let's just say we talked about fusion earlier, ITER, or the Large Hadron Collider. Those are programs that Congress has to choose to fund through agencies, or there are international collaboration programs that are funded through the National Science Foundation, Department of State. Those are all things that are really important. So making the case that international science, and as I say, American science, one unique characteristic about it is inherently international. And there are scientific challenges that have to be international. And where do we see that? The pandemic. And had it not been for our scientific collaborations with China at the time, we wouldn't have gotten the DNA of COVID and been able to quickly come up with a vaccine to fight it. And I worry because we're moving in an environment where there are members who just think we don't share anything. We don't do any scientific work with China. And on things like that, we would have been in real soup had we not had those relationships. So the other thing I'd say is it goes beyond just arguing for funding. That's what we talked about today, but talking about why international science and why science has to be international. That's another important topic. So something we need help with as well.
Yeah. Michael, I see that you came off of mute. Do you have a question? No. Okay, Georgia?
Yeah. So I was thinking during the first session yesterday, we spoke a lot about trust in science, but how trustworthy are the people in like Congress? You know, when they tell you like, okay, I will support your cause. Is it gonna happen for sure? Maybe, yes, no, maybe they can change.
Maybe I can add some flavor to that. Do you have an example, like you said with Senator Britt, that was really excited about, the posts where what you've been doing behind the scenes that it worked also? Like how do you know that they're saying they're going to support science and or they say they're going to support, something that you're working on in your campaign and your campaigns are working?
I can start, but I want to hear Justin's answer to the trustworthiness. But let me start on that one. How do we know that Senator Britt really cares? She sent a letter. She made it public. She
Wow.
sent that letter. That was the action. So don't just let them say, I mean, okay, those lobbying groups that are really effective are the ones that know when a vote is going to happen. It's harder with science because it's often appropriations. But don't just say, it's being tricky too. It's say, would you weigh in? Would you send a letter to the appropriators encouraging them to support science if they're not on the appropriations committee? It's getting as direct as possible. Not only just saying, would you support NSF, but the way we do it is, would you send a letter? We'd really like a letter. Why does Senator Britt care? Well, she's got a place called, the University of Alabama that has a lot of medical research. So she's heard from them and she's heard from patient groups. So her way to show that she cares is to say, I really do care. I led this letter. And the other thing is, again, this gets back to the thank you, right? I'm going to give you an example. When I worked for Michigan, Debbie Stabenow, who's the former senator from Michigan, was then in the House. She would always lead a letter urging funding for the space grant program, which funds NASA undergraduate research in space. She'd get all her colleagues to sign that letter. And one of the things that the University of Michigan, the engineering school did to help her, because she led that letter, is they hosted a space day on campus. She got to send out to all her constituents, hey, come to space day. We'll shoot rockets. We'll do all this great stuff. I'm going to be there. And the University of Michigan will host you and teach your kids about STEM. That's a great way to say thank you. Give her visibility on the issue she cares about. Give her a chance to meet with constituents to thank her for what she did to support those very programs that are enabling them to then do that day to teach younger people about the importance of STEM. So be creative in how you thank people. But that's just a great example, I think, of how a member really demonstrated that they cared, not just say, oh yeah, I support science.
So
So
trust but verify might be the
correct. And what I would say is, I can tell you there were certain groups out there that my boss voted the wrong way. Within 5 minutes of that vote, I was getting phone calls. They
okay.
knew what was going on. So, and those are the really effective. It's harder with science because the funding is buried, but it can be done.
Bury in the budget. Remember one of the tactics. We have another question that says, if we still have some time, Toby and Justin, your thoughts and reactions of OSTP's FY27 R&D memo that they released the other day and how it should inform science groups or advocates. If you've had a chance to digest it and have thoughts.
I have yet to digest that, but Irene, if you want to shoot me a message, I'll give you my email and I am happy to answer that. I did
So,
see it. I just haven't had a minute to really digest it and take it
so
all
Yeah.
in.
here's an example of, in fact, one of our Matt, who's not with us today, even suggested this about the memo. We're coming up on a time when we may see a government shutdown. If that government shutdown happens, what that memo says is, here are really important areas we need to be investing in. to remain competitive, these are the priorities of the administration. Those areas are going to be, there'll be grant funding that doesn't go out in those areas. There'll be science that is delayed. There'll be universities that can't move forward with funding on grants because they can't get the money. So the shutdown itself, what Matt was saying is use this as a way to kind of, these are your talking points, your key areas to stress about the importance. So when you write your letters to Congress, especially if they're going to Republicans, look at that. Make sure to use some of those, funding for the National Science Foundation supports artificial intelligence. It supports quantum research. These are all very important priorities for the administration as illustrated in the funding memo for 27 that they just put out. So use that as those are the keywords that are going to resonate particularly with Republicans because this administration is saying they're the priorities. So use those, even if you can tie them to your own research, that's another good way. But those are the buzzwords. You're not going to say climate change when you're writing to Republicans. You might with Democrats, but not Republicans. Because
And
that's why climate change does not appear in that memo as a priority.
that's a good tip for grant writing as well.
Correct.
Use the language of the funder. Great. Well, we are at time. I want to thank Justin and Toby. Thank you for describing behind the scenes, grassroots letter writing campaign and why storytelling about your own research is such an important impact. Thank you so much. And as they shared the resources about sharing your story and writing to your leaders in Congress are available to you. If you need some support or would like a review of that, send it to info@scipolnetwork.org and we can take a quick look at that. And then send it, and we will send you a certificate of accomplishment from NSPN that you can post on your LinkedIn. And we will have tomorrow's session giving you more behind the scenes tactics on what you can do to influence policy on the state and federal level. Thank you so much. Appreciate you too.
Thank you.
Thanks.